Good evening. My name is Associate Professor Sarah Wakes. I'd like to welcome you to the Patricia Colman Lecture 2017 as the Chair of the Board of Studies of Applied Science. The Patricia Colman Lecture is held in tribute to the work and interests of the late Emeritus Professor Patricia Colman in recognition of her contributions to education, University of Otago and the New Zealand community. The Patricia Colman Public Lecture has been held since 1987, and we are honoured that Nicola Gaston has accepted the invitation to be the Patricia Colman Speaker for 2017. The lecture is on topics that relate to Patricia Colman's interests. She had many wide-ranging interests, and the topic science and equity would be of particular interest to a woman who once attended a black tie university event resplendent in evening attire and the suggested black tie. Science and equity were themes central to her life's work. From 1911 onwards, both from the School of Home Sciences in Dunedin and through the Distance Teaching Network, women tirelessly transformed the health and lives of New Zealanders through the sharing of scientific knowledge related to microbiology, human nutrition, anatomy, histology, chemistry, and so much more. In 2012, the successor to Home Sciences, Consumer and Applied Sciences, was transformed once again to merge and form the new Applied Science programme, hence me being here to introduce you. With over 100 years of women and science at the University of Otago, science and equity remains an important issue. So I'd like to introduce our speaker, Nicola Gaston. She's Associate Professor in Physics at the University of Auckland and Deputy Director of the McDermott Institute for Advanced Materials and Nanotechnology, a New Zealand Centre of Research Excellence. As a principal investigator in the Institute, her group has worked extensively on quantum mechanical simulations of the melting behaviour of metal nanoparticles, which has developed our understanding of how the fundamental properties of materials change as they become nanostructured. Nicola was the 2016 awardee of the CMMSE Prize for contributions in the field of computational chemistry, in particular for her work on the properties of atomic clusters. She was president of the New Zealand Association of Scientists in 2014 to 15, and is the author of Why Science is Sexist, published by Bridget Williams Books in 2015. And tonight she is the Patricia Colman for 2017. I'd like to welcome Nicola.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Well, thank you for having me. It's really an honour to be here. It's a huge privilege, and I'm quite excited by the opportunity to talk about something which is very dear to my heart, so science and equity, but in a context that maybe allows me to broaden out my take on this, my perspective on this, from what I normally talk about, which is usually focused quite particularly on gender, and I think you'll find that that's still a common theme in a lot of what I'm talking about tonight, the experiences of women in science. But what I'm hoping to do, and what I hope I've been able to do, is broaden that out to consider how we deal with equity more generally in science, and why it might be something that we need to concern ourselves with. Oh, I can, presumably. I'm not sure if it's a control on here. I might leave this. Shall I, is that better? Perfect, all right. Thank you to my delightful assistant. That's very, very helpful. So it was interesting to be asked to give this because I've never heard of Patricia Colman. And I did do a little bit of Googling, and I usually rate my skills as somebody who can get on the internet and find things out. But it turns out she's quite a hard person to find things out about. But I was sent some information, which was wonderful, to provide a bit of context to what I'm talking about. And so I have these two pictures of her, both of which I think are lovely. She looks very serious and quite determined as a woman. A woman who knows her mind, I think. And what's clear is that she made a very large contribution to what was then the home science faculty being dean for close to 25 years, I think that is. So really quite a significant figure in the history of the university, you would think. And it might be that in addition to having a lecture named in her honour, that she needs a little bit more prominence and recognition online, since I struggled to find out very much about her. And there's something in that around science and the prominence of science, perhaps, and the prominence of women in science, which inspires some of what I'm going to say tonight. So I've talked about women in science in a few different fora at this point, and the title of the book that I wrote on the subject was Why Science is Sexist. And that always it causes some concern in some audiences that sexist is quite a strong word to be thrown around casually, perhaps. But I like to cite my sources, and there is a Nature, actually a whole issue of Nature from 2014, which I would use as my citation for the particular claim that science is sexist. The initial statement being here that science remains institutionally sexist. And what we mean by that institutionally sexist is that while we might not know all the causes, we might not know all the mechanisms by which disproportionate gender representation comes about, we do know what the status quo is. We do know what the current representation of men and women is in the sciences across different forms of science and at different levels of seniority in science. And on that basis, actually, it's perfectly valid to say that science is institutionally sexist. And the question I became very interested in is why. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that, and then talk a little bit more about themes of equity in general. So women are underrepresented in science. That's a very straightforward thing to say. It does depend a little bit on what level of seniority you're looking at. This is referred to sometimes as a scissor plot, because you start from high school level where more or less by construction, the relative representation of men and women is equitable. And then as people progress through their lives, through their careers, there is a division of the ways, a parting of the ways, if you like, in terms of outcomes from bachelor level study all the way through to top academic positions, which is where this is a plot usually ends. I quite like this version because it goes all the way to Nobel Prizes, where the discrepancy is quite stunning. And so this is often referred to as a problem. It is a problem in some sense, but it's also something that's quite interesting for us to unpick and understand what's going on here. So this is a small plug for my book. I actually won't stick on, won't dwell on this at all. Just I guess as a presentation of where I'm coming from. That is something I've written. But the reason I wrote that was actually based on personal experience, not so much of sexism directed at me, and I'm reasonably clear about that in the book, but just an environment in which strange things seem to happen from time to time. And so this is an invitation I was sent by my HR department when I was working as a research scientist at IRL, or Industrial Research Limited, which used to be one of the CRIs, or Crown Research Institutes in New Zealand. And I worked there for about 5 years, and close to the end of that 5-year period, I was sent this invitation. You can see it's to an event at GNS Science. GNS is also one of the CRIs. It's supported by the Royal Society of New Zealand. It involves a 1-hour session from Di McCarthy, who was the chief executive of the Royal Society of New Zealand. But notably, it also included a 2-hour session on how to dress to influence, right? So the takeaway from this is that not just that you might want to learn how to dress to influence, but that the problem, as demonstrated by that scissor plot, that the underlying cause, the hypothesis suggested by this invitation is that the underlying cause and problem is that women don't know how to dress properly. And not just don't know how to dress properly, but don't know how to dress to influence. Right? And there's something very, it's not even that subtle in there. It's something that suggests that women don't have power and should always be influencing those who have power rather than actually trying to make decisions. So this was, it's something I've thought about quite a lot since, quite how these misconceptions come about and how much damage poor messaging about equity can do. So you can imagine receiving this as a young woman, that it sends a signal which is really quite counterproductive, let's say. And I've learned a lot since then about similar messaging when we target, say, Māori and Pacifica communities, who tend to be even much worse represented in science, let's say. And it's very, very important that we be conscious of the way that we send messages to groups that we might be honestly concerned about for good reason, but that we might be sending the wrong signals to. So that's one of the key takeaways that I learned from this experience. There are, unfortunately, quite a number of examples of the same sort of thing. So this is a still from a video that was put together by the European Commission to encourage girls into science. Because of the scissor plot, which also demonstrates something called the leaky pipeline, where there's sort of a conceptual pipeline from undergraduate study through to seniority, out of which women are seen as the things that leak. In order to correct that, the idea is that you have to get more girls into studying science, that somehow they don't stick it out because they don't like it enough, or there just aren't enough of them to begin with. And what was interesting about this particular initiative is not just the video itself, which involved these young women dancing around, dressed up rather smartly, wearing lab glasses and lipstick at the same time, but the backlash to this video, which was very strongly definite, I suppose, that science and femininity, or science and lipstick, do not go together. And there's a problem in that just as much as there's a problem in saying that girls need to have symbolism around lipstick in order to be attracted into science. And in both cases, it's kind of problematic. And so some of these messages, some of these campaigns that are very well intentioned can do damage because people are sending the wrong signals about what's actually important. There's another more recent one. This is from only about a year ago. IBM decided that they need more women in engineering, of course, and the way to get more women into engineering is to have a campaign about how to hack a hairdryer. How do you use a hairdryer in order to do scientific research of some sort? And so they put a video together, which you can still find online, about hacking a hairdryer and doing interesting stuff with it. Again, it's, I would say, both the initial video, but some of the emphasis of the response to it, some of the rejection of the messages in the video, both of these things are a bit problematic, and they show some of the issues that we have about believing that science or scientific discovery and being a woman are not compatible things. Right. And so I have this example up because it's one of the first examples that I saw that really hammered this point home for me about the messaging mattering, and that actually the only way to get past this is for people to understand the root causes of the problem. And so this is from a presentation by Larry Summers, who's an economist who was the president of Harvard at the time that he gave this, lecture. And I always leave this prelude in because I think it's important to recognize that he said explicitly when he gave the talk that he was there to provoke, and he'd only agreed to give this talk on the basis that he could be provocative. And then he goes to say that on many, many different human attributes, height, weight, propensity for criminality, overall IQ, mathematical ability, scientific ability, let's not worry about the difference in averages, but there's a difference in the variability between male populations and female populations. And so when he says this, what he's doing is referring to some sort of, he's referring to sort of a scientific way of thinking about things, that's the reference to the population, and the variability, in particular when he's talking about standard deviations. But the key message is that actually if the variability of a male population is greater, that means there will be more very smart men and more very stupid men. That's basically the idea. And because what we're seeing at the top end, at the far end of the scissor plot, is who makes it all the way through, it's the top achievers, if you like, that could be explained by a hypothesis such as this. Now, I don't want to overemphasize this particular speech, except that it is something that's stuck around in the literature quite a lot. And I think it's important to actually look at something like this and be prepared to say, actually, there's some pseudoscience in here. He's comparing things like height and weight, which are nicely measurable quantities, with things like scientific ability, mathematical ability, propensity for criminality, whatever that is, which are measured in very different ways, which can't really be disentangled from different causes. And then he's talking about something like IQ, which is measurable, but not really representative of what you think it's representative of, if you think it's an objective identifier of intelligence. So there are quite a few issues I'd have as a scientist just with this message, of which conflates a whole lot of things which are not at all comparable. So that's my response to Larry Summers. This is a little still from Fargo. Some of you may have seen the movie, some of you may not have. Yeah, it's just not quite right in the messaging itself. It also turns out it's not supported by the literature. The biggest predictor of gender differences in performance on maths tests, for example, is simply the extent of emancipation or liberation or equality for women in the country where those measurements or exams are being performed. So it's very, very, very clear that there are cultural influences which affect gender differences, which can be measured in scientific disciplines and in mathematics. And whenever anybody's looked for biological differences, for biologically determined differences, the literature has basically diminished over time. There were some studies originally which showed a few minor discrepancies, but most of those have now gone over time. And so the study that I often refer to in the context of science, which does actually start to provide a first explanation of what's going on, is this particular study from 2014, so it's not that old, which is, no, 2012, which is entitled, as you can read, Science Faculty's Subtle Gender Biases Favour Male Students. And in retrospect, it's kind of surprising to me that this study got as much attention as it did. On the other hand, it came out around about the same month that I got that HR invitation that was going to teach me to dress properly. So it struck me, certainly at the time, and I remember going through it and thinking, well, there's something in this, and there's something in this that people need to know about. So that was really where my interest came. I put a talk together based on this paper and a little bit based on the HR invitation that I'd had, and I gave it at my workplace. What does this paper actually show? Well, what it does is it takes a CV for an applicant for a research assistant or a laboratory manager, rather, in a scientific discipline between physics, chemistry, and biology. That CV is sent to academics in the United States at a range of different institutions. They're asked to evaluate the CV for the competence, the hireability of the candidate, whether or not they'd be willing to mentor the person described by the CV, and they're also asked to nominate a salary that they would offer that person. So this seems straightforward. The only complicating factor is that the name at the top of the CV was changed from Jennifer to John, randomly. And based on the gender associated with the name at the top of the CV, the competence and hireability and mentoring scores all differed significantly. Right. So this showed a clear bias for the male candidate based on nothing other than that gender. And this is a plot that shows the salary difference that was offered to the male and the female candidate. I'm very sorry, because I know that many of you in the audience will object to the fact that the y-axis doesn't go to 0. The difference between the two is only about 12%. But that is around the scale of the gender pay gap, which is maybe useful to keep in mind. So, I worry at times, not only that the messaging is wrong because we don't understand the root causes of inequity, but that some of the solutions that are proposed actually do damage by, well, as summarised by The Onion, inspiring girls to earn less than men in scientific careers. This is supposed to be satire. It hits a little too close to home for me. One thing that's really important about this particular study is that the academics involved were both women and men, and what that tells us is that unconscious bias is something that we all have. So if you're interested in actually understanding what this looks like or how this can be measured, you can go and do the implicit bias test, which is something from Harvard that's online. It's very easy to find if you just Google. And so this is the result that I get if I go in and basically just tap the keyboard to indicate an association. Yes, of these words, do these belong together or do they not belong together? And my data suggest, not very surprisingly, that I'm biased. I could do the test again. I know how it works now. I could probably improve my score. That's not the point. The point is not to do that well. The point is to understand that these associations are cultural. We all live with them. We all have them. And that's why we need to acknowledge them in order to do better. Unfortunately, in science, these things, these initial biases around just competence translate into biases in all sorts of other metrics and measurements that we use to evaluate how people do, how good they are, which seems like a thing that it should be possible to measure simply, but it turns out that it's quite complicated. So this is a particular study which looks at the association of publication topic with gender. As evaluated by the participants in the study, they assigned some topics to be male-typed and some topics to be female-typed. And some, they say, oh, these are more or less in the middle. And what happens is that it turns out that if a topic is male-typed, there is a considerable penalty for women publishing in that area, that the evaluation of publication quality decreases significantly. On the other hand, if something is female-typed, there's a slight penalty for men, but it's much, much smaller. And if something is gender-neutral, it turns out, good, this is probably a validation of the assignment of those topics as gender-neutral. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. All right. This is a follow-up to that, which is the ratings of interest in collaborating with those people based on the quality of the publication and the gender, as shown in the previous plot. And again, you see more or less the same thing. Women pay a penalty for trying to compete in male-typed disciplines. When it comes to publication in science, and in academia in general, this has become much more of a standard problem for all of us, but in science it's perhaps more acute. The order of publication is tricky, and I actually refer to this particular study because of this quote, which I think is really important. Because what it clarifies to me is, again, this message of how it matters how we talk about these things, and how the idea that women choose to leave science and that because it's a choice that's okay is something that really doesn't sit well with me anymore, based on these kinds of statements. The self-doubting aspects of what women report about why they leave science, it's very, very uncomfortable. So male scientists publish more than female scientists, it turns out. The types of authorship, whether you're the most senior author on the paper or not, and how much credit you therefore get for the work, that varies quite significantly. Some of this is probably just the leaky pipeline, the fact that women are not getting through to levels of seniority. But there's a chicken and egg situation there. Is it that they're not getting through because they're not getting the credit, or is it that they are not getting the credit and therefore not getting through? There are other things that seem to affect publications. Men cite themselves a lot more than women. That's one thing that's been fairly clearly demonstrated to be true. Okay, that's a behavioural difference. On the other hand, this is a really recent study. This just came out, I think I saw a review of it in Science just 2 weeks ago maybe. And what they looked at is first-year PhD students, where those first-year PhD students are typically not the first author. They haven't done the most work and written the paper, and they're certainly not the senior author, the one at the end. So they're probably in the middle. And what that means is that whether or not their name goes on the paper is largely up to their supervisor. It's a judgment call. Have they done enough work in support of the first author as part of a team to be credited with publication or not? And this is something that you would think, or you would hope, would be equitable, but it might be that actually it's not. One thing that the authors looked at very carefully is how much experience the students had coming into their PhD, how much confidence they had in their research skills, so whether that was influencing the likelihood of them getting credit. And they were able to make a very strong statement that that was simply not happening. And the outcome of the study is simply that for a given amount of time spent on research, male students were 15% more likely to be credited with authorship. And so there's something there about social dynamics in the laboratory and research groups that maybe we need to think about. So what bothers me a bit when we talk about science and equity is the stereotype of what a scientist is. So these are just the first few images that popped up when I first gave a talk about this, and I just Google image searched what a scientist is, up pop these things. And so when you're thinking about where the unconscious biases come from that I'm talking about, it's actually not that hard to see. This is a reasonably good reflection of them. What was disappointing at the time was that this is the first picture of a woman that popped up. All right. There are many other things. I'm going to gloss over a few of these, but one of the ones I want to touch on is the student evaluations problem, because this is teaching related rather than research related. And the way university careers work, a lot of the time we think that teaching might be, or teaching is perhaps, let's say that another way, teaching roles are perhaps where women tend to end up a little bit more, and so you might think that they would get more credit for being good teachers, because that at least would explain why more of them turn up in teaching roles. Turns out that, according to student evaluations, this is not the case. And one particular question, the idea of promptness in returning work to students, on a 5-point scale, women scored a whole point worse than men in this particular study. So this was done for a course taught remotely over the internet. Half the students thought they had a male instructor, half of them thought they had a female instructor. All of them actually, I'll say that differently. Of the ones who thought they had a male instructor, half of them actually did, and half of them had the woman, and vice versa, and the other way. And so what this actually hammers home is this point about promptness, is that actually there's something that we would possibly refer to as a benevolent, a kind of stereotype about women. Women being caring, women being more likely to give you attention, perhaps. These kinds of stereotypes, what we sometimes think of as relatively benevolent ways of thinking about the differences between men and women, about thinking about gender stereotypes, actually are not as benevolent as we might think. So, And it gets worse from there. There's this study, which this occasion about 18 months ago, where a journal article was reviewed, and the review was sent back by the editor to the authors, and the comments were that a male author needed to be added to the paper to counteract the evident bias, the lack of objectivity of the two young women who were writing the article, which is kind of an interesting thing. So there's an increasing set of data, I suppose, on both incidents, but also on mechanisms and structures that enable inequity to persist on the basis that it already exists, and our inclination as human beings is to think that what exists is what is natural, and it must be that way for a reason. It is that way for a reason, but that's historical inequity that we kind of should have thought we'd gotten past by now. So I put a little poem in at this point. Again, just to reiterate what I've already said about how it matters how we have this conversation. Because there's a problem when you're talking about gender, in particular, if it's a conversation in which men get to be objective and women don't. Right? So the poem goes like this. He tells her that the earth is flat. He knows the facts, and that is that. In altercations fierce and long, she tries her best to prove him wrong. But he has learned to argue well. He calls her arguments unsound and often asks her not to yell. She cannot win, he stands his ground. The planet goes on being round. And when you look at the very pointy end of where equity affects people's careers and people's lives, it's often at the very junior level of achievement in academia. And there, a lot of what is happening is, a lot of where we see the leaky pipeline is where women are leaving research around the time that they start a family because things just get too hard. And what's interesting is that there's been a push to create mechanisms and research funding and other in other places that there's a concept of relative to opportunity, that if you have had time out of the workforce, that needs to be accounted for. And unfortunately, it feels like that's a little bit of a joke that gets played on people. It's not actually taken as seriously as it should be. So in that original study that I showed you, the CV with the two names, John and Jennifer, one of the hypotheses that was suggested by the authors was that they needed to do this study on scientists, despite the fact that these kinds of unconscious biases have been demonstrated in many, many, many studies, because scientists might somehow be more objective than the average person, right? And you've already seen the results, so we know that this is a hypothesis that was proved to not be correct. We might think of objectivity as a virtue in science. It might be something that we aspire for our research outcomes to be, but that doesn't mean that we are objective, no more than anybody else. And yet, objectivity in science is really, really important. So I've thrown up a couple of definitions here. One from Wikipedia. It's something really fundamental to what scientific truth is. If something is scientifically true, it should be some kind of objective reality. But the second definition is maybe slightly better in the sense that it talks about the scientific method and results. And what makes science objective, let's say, is that we don't just produce our results and let them sit there forever. We expect and hope and sometimes convince somebody else to go and reproduce the work that we've done to demonstrate that it is something that is true in more than one set of experiments. Right. But objectivity is really important in this whole conversation about equity because it crops up in different places. There's this problem of who gets to be objective, but there's also a problem of if we consider ourselves objective, how does that affect how we make decisions? So this is a study which is a little bit like the CV study I showed you before, but where there's a male CV and a female CV. But there are actually two CVs, and they are different. One of them is a more educated candidate, and the other is a more experienced candidate. These are CVs for the job of police chief. And what's interesting is that depending on whether the person is more educated or more experienced, well, that actually doesn't affect the choice. What matters much more is just the gender at the top of the CV, right? But there is a silver lining, and I like this part because it's a little bit of a clue as to how we can do things better. If you're asked to commit to some criteria for choosing one of the CVs beforehand, that effect goes away. If you're asked to actually say, well, is education more important or experience? What am I looking for in the CV? Then it turns out we can do that. But the really interesting thing is that that level of bias that's shown in that study depends strongly on how objective you perceive yourself to be. And this may seem counterintuitive, but it turns out if you think you're very objective, you're more likely to just be relying on your unconscious biases. Whereas if you are aware that you might not be that objective a person, you might be more likely to look at the criteria that you're using to decide which CV you prefer. And so objectivity is a little bit of a problem at the heart of scientific culture, I think. And so when we talk about equity, when we talk about women in science, or when we talk about Māori and Pacifica in science, or when we talk about other marginalised groups in science, who is we? It's somehow a thing that we need to disentangle. We need to think a lot more about being inclusive about how we have these conversations and not just portraying the same old faces, the Einsteins and the Rutherfords and even the Marie Curies, as being representative of who scientists are. And there are a few issues that have cropped up in the last few years that really demonstrate that this is still a problem. So these great figures of science are more or less epitomised by Nobel Prize winners, let's say. And so there was this issue with Tim Hunt in the UK a couple of years ago, which spawned this distractingly sexy hashtag because he made this comment to a room full of journalists that, you know, women are distractingly sexy, they cry in the lab, it's difficult to have them around. And this is a quote from actually a separate interview. And he's, you know, he just doesn't really get the issue. And I'm not going to say he's a dreadful person for not getting the issue. What I'm going to say is that the respect that we give people as Nobel Prize winners can be somewhat limited to their scientific achievements. We don't necessarily need to give them a platform to talk about equity or gender issues if they know nothing about it. That's really what I'm saying. They're not magic medals of blamelessness. This is a nice way it was put by someone called Maki Naro, who's a comic writer. And what I think we're allowed to do is criticise people's actions without saying that the person themselves is a problem. We can just say, look, they might not understand this issue, they're not the best person to be talking about it. Maybe their opinion on gender is not significant. What's worrisome when these issues crop up is how much backlash there is towards trying to deal with equity. And I think this is something that we all need to be aware of when we're talking about the subject. It's yet another example of why how we talk about it matters. I won't dwell on this, but no, I won't dwell on this. There's a quite lovely essay on the topic that I do recommend, though, at this link here, which you can find reasonably easily, The Rage of a Scholarship Student in an Elite School. And it covers this idea of objectivity and the fact that it's something that people have because of their own privilege, right? We practiced this objectivity at university. The best person to talk about wealth in class was an upper middle class person because she supposedly could look at it dispassionately. The best person to talk about race was a white person for the same reasons. The best person to talk about gender was a boy. So who is it that gets to be objective? I quite like this little cartoon of a rationalist. My objective logic proves white men objectively deserve everything we have because we're so super objective. It feels like that's sometimes the perspective that I get from white men, I would say, but I've learnt to worry much more that when I talk about race issues, for example, that I'm projecting the same kinds of things, and I think we all need to be very conscious of this. Right, so this is a picture, one of the few pictures I found when I was looking for Patricia Colman on the internet. So these are some students from the School of Home Science, 1920, and it's quite a nice picture. They're looking rather happy. It's a little bit disturbing that this isn't a picture of them actually studying. This is a picture of them in the kitchen at their residence. That's one of the few pictures I could find, but yeah. And so what I want to reflect on, given the context of this lecture, is what the origin is of different levels of inequity, say, in different forms of science, different kinds of science. And so this is looking at the percentage of bachelor's degrees conferred to women in the United States by topic, by subject area. And I think all I'm really going to say is that it's increased over time, but there are big differences between different fields. And that's one of the things that we need to understand in order to judge whether what we understand about gender and science is whether it stacks up. But it turns out there's a rather nice study that has looked at this already. So this is just from 2015, I think, yes. Expectations of brilliance, it says, underlie gender distributions across academic disciplines. What does that mean? Well, the participants in the study are asked to say whether they think that talent is what determines success in their field or whether it's actually about hard work. And it turns out there's quite a divergence of opinion about that issue. And it also turns out that different disciplines kind of have different cultures, different levels of belief in this idea. So on the left-hand side, if we just concentrate on those two plots, the top one is for scientific subjects and the bottom one is for the humanities. And on the left-hand side, we have disciplines that believe that it's more about hard work. And on the right-hand side of the plot, we have disciplines that believe that innate talent is something that is really important for success. And what you see is that the gender equal disciplines are things like education, social science, psychology. They're much more gender equal and they believe in the value of hard work, whereas things like physics and maths and philosophy are all at the end of the spectrum where somehow it's about the talent that you bring to the subject. That's what's actually going to determine if you're successful or not. And the problem with this, I would think, should be obvious to anybody who's ever taught. If you tell your students that hard work doesn't matter, you're not going to be able to teach them very well. So there is something really, really important about this concept of insisting that hard work is what matters, and that is how you undermine the stereotypes that lead to a disproportionate number of men, I think. On the right-hand side, there are two different plots, and these are looking at ethnicity. So the top one, where there is a correlation, is for African Americans getting their PhDs in the United States. The numbers are much lower overall, as you can see, but there's some correlation. The bottom one is for Asian Americans, and you see that the stereotype is not so predictive of those kinds of beliefs. However, in New Zealand, of course, we have similar issues. So this is from a study, an article, an investigation really carried out by a reporter at the New Zealand Herald, Kirsty Johnson, last year, which is really, I think, rather worth a read. And it describes this idea that students go into their classes at school even and can be made to feel to belong or not belong based on the subject that they're walking into. And so it describes this experience of Amelia Anufe walking into a physics class and being asked if she was in the right place, and she was the only brown kid in the room. These experiences translate into numbers. Only 10% of Pacifica students take NCEA Level 2 physics. 17% of students nationally do, so it's about half. At Decile 1, which is at the pointy end of the spectrum, only 3% of Māori take Level 2 physics. Right? That's a total of 68 kids nationally, and only half of them pass. So the numbers are really bad, but relating those numbers back to the experiences of students and understanding that their experiences matter and that they're part of the problem, that's one of the really important things that I think we need to do. Physics in particular, well, I work these days in a physics department. I've jumped around a bit in my career. I've been in a chemistry department, I've been in an applied maths group, which is when I was working at Industrial Research Limited. So I've been in a few different places. But physics is definitely also at the pointy end of the spectrum, right? So this is a plot which looks at the percentage, the cumulative percentage of Nobel Prize winners in physics. I realized I hadn't put that in the title. Who are women. And what I worry about when we talk about how much things are getting better is that actually we've got this cumulative experience of a century or so of scientific investigation, the history of which is really common, it's well captured, it's in all the textbooks, it's easily Googleable, we can find out all this information about all these people. And when I teach, I like to tell stories about the people I'm talking about. When Marie Curie won the Nobel Prize, 1903, we had 17% of the Nobel Prize winners in physics being women. And the thing is that we're now as bad as it's ever been in a cumulative sense. So when you think about the historical weight of representation and how that affects how we think about who belongs in science, there's a sense in which it's not actually getting better. I'll also throw up a couple of examples I found in a solutions manual or a problem set for students. I haven't given these to students, I wouldn't do that. But there's this stupid question about Adam and Eve, which has this initial answer, Adam, because the man is always right. No, none of the answers I've actually got up here are the correct answer, so don't worry about that. But just little things like this in physics textbooks, it tells you that something's wrong in the culture, that these things can slide by for so long. Or there's this really creepy one about a girl sitting in the water and a boy looking up at her toes and wanting to touch them. It's, yeah. Anyway, not to be too mean about physics, but. So I joined the physics department at Auckland about a year ago, and it was about 3 months after my book came out. And so I had been contacted by a journalist, and she wanted to write about this. And she went off and she wrote about it, and she came back to me, and she said, here's the thing, but I want to run it past you because it might be a bit awkward. And she started reading it out, and she says, Richard, Jeff, Gilles, Stuart, Neil, Dennis, Howard, and I don't know how many names she got through, but maybe half a dozen. And I knew exactly what she was doing, which was listing all the names of the academics on the Auckland Physics Department website. And I said to her, Jenny, this is interesting. I said, you might not know, but I'm going to be joining the physics department at Auckland in a couple of months. And she said, do you want me to take it out? Do you think it's a bad intro? And I said, oh, well, that's very effective. It's a bit awkward. I don't know how people will feel about it, but I said, no, go ahead. It's what you've written. And so it's interesting. It tells you something about the small world nature of talking about these things. But there is something else that I wanted to point out to expand upon this particular point, which is that this piece is entitled The S Word, which you might think just means science, or you might think it means sexism, but there's another word in here which is really important, which is status. So the relative status of different forms of science, the relative status of men and women, these things are mixed up and entangled, the relative status of different groups in society. Status is actually the thing that underlines everything that we're talking about. And there is a bit of an issue in that when we talk about equity as a big concept, equity requires that some people improve in status and some people lose status. And that makes it hard. Of course it makes it hard, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. The status of science is something that does come under pressure from time to time. There's the idea of a science march, which is happening in April, probably around New Zealand in support of a science march that's happening in the United States in response to Trump. And I've written about this a little bit. because I do think it's very important that we talk about why knowledge is important, why scientific knowledge is important. But it's interesting because it does seem that one of the causes of defensiveness about equity in science is this feeling of threat that the status of science itself might be at risk. And I think we need to acknowledge that as part of the conversation about how we move forward. I throw up a little example of the kind of defensiveness that I've run into since I started talking about this. This is a newspaper clipping that a friend's mother cut out of the Christchurch Press and provided to me, which I think is quite cute, which is why it's the one I use. I've seen various things that are quite similar. And a lot of people want to believe that this kind of stuff is natural, that the relative level of representation is there for a reason, because it's what has been true their whole life, and it's really hard to acknowledge that sometimes things just may have been wrong for a long time. But I think there's no other way to make progress. Here, this person is talking about the relative difference in brain size actually being the cause of the different performance of men and women in science. Well, they go on a little bit of a rant about mating behaviour beforehand. I don't think you need to read it in particular. It's not that original. And one of the things that's important to think about when you think about the status of science is what it's based on. And this is a really old conversation. This goes back to C.P. Snow and his lecture book, The Two Cultures, which was something that came out in the 60s, I think, in the UK. And he talks about this, but in particular, the comparison between science and the humanities and their relative status. And I mention this because I came down here originally for a panel discussion yesterday for the Love Humanities campaign of the TEU, because I think it's really important that actually when we ascribe some status to science, we don't try and do it at the cost of putting down other forms of knowledge. When we ascribe some status to a particular form of science, say physics, we shouldn't do that by putting down other forms of science. There's no sense in which that benefits any of us. And so it's a lecture worth reading because he does talk about societal forces, and he talks very clearly and very directly about the class system in the UK at the time, which is actually I would say, the two cultures that he's talking about are actually the upper and lower classes, or the upper and middle classes more directly in the UK at the time, rather than the sciences and the humanities at all. So I've talked about equity, and I just want to touch on this point that equity is not quite the same thing as equality. Equality tends to be a legal construct, that men and women have the same rights. Equity is more about outcomes. It's more about whether actually, whether the potential for real achievement is the same. And so we've got two different cartoons here which illustrate the equity problem, perhaps, that we don't always start from the same starting point. Unconscious biases get in the way for certain groups of people more than for others. And some of these things are invisible and some of them aren't, but we need to keep in mind that we don't always know the kinds of obstacles other people have had to overcome. So I thought I'd finish with a few reading recommendations, just not my book in particular, but things that I've read that have been really influential. Delusions of Gender is a great one for just unpacking some of the literature that's out there, the men are from Mars, women are from Venus type things about the differences between men and women. Most of it's rubbish. The quote from John Stuart Mill I quite like here because it really describes this tendency to want to believe that things are the way that they are for a reason, for good reason. And unfortunately, if you look at how things happen and the underlying causes and the mechanisms by which processes happen, such as career progression, then you learn that actually a lot of this is not necessarily true. There's a new book by Cordelia Fine, so the same author as the previous book, Delusions of Gender. This is called Testosterone Rex, and it's interesting to me because it's a slightly punchier version of the first book, which is really in response to the fact that there's quite a lot that's happened in popular culture, which is pushing back against equity, pushing back against feminism, I'll mention Breitbart very quickly. The title of that's supposed to be "Here's Why There Ought to Be a Cap on Women Studying Science and Maths." This is an article from Breitbart Media, and some of you may know that one of the Trump administration's team is the head of Breitbart Media, and they push this kind of message, which is largely based in the idea that actually men have somehow been emasculated by feminism, and that's really where this idea of testosterone rex comes from, that Cordelia Fine is unpacking in her latest book, which has just very recently come out. So I want to finish with a little bit of a reflection on my own research, if I can. And this is in response to some things about scientific culture that bother me still. So there's this statement from Stephen Hawking just late last year, which was basically a prediction that we've got about 1,000 years to find a new place to live, he reckons, because the planet's going to be exhausted, something's going to go wrong, we're going to civilization will collapse catastrophically between now and then. And he's gone with 1,000 years, so there's a decent chance he's right, I don't know. But that's not really the point. The point is that maybe we do have a lot of challenges, but the solutions that we come up with as scientists and as human beings, they depend on our perspectives, they depend on our experiences. And so he's come up with this idea that we have to leave the planet. And this is a concept that's deeply entangled in scientific or science fiction culture, if you like. And so this is moving into Stella, where there's this quote, we're not meant to save the world, we're meant to leave it. It's all very, very dark when you start to think about it, but that's somehow the solution. The end of Earth will not be the end of us, it says. Well, there's this moment, it's like we've forgotten who we are, Donald. Explorers, pioneers, not caretakers. And there's something in that, despite on top of the very colonialist perspective of explorers and pioneers, but it's that not caretakers that really made me think about Patricia Colman again, and the idea of home science, the applied sciences tradition here perhaps, which is maybe subverting that in a way and saying, well, actually, some things can be valuable even if they're not. Yeah, there's something really, really important about understanding that the values we ascribe to science, this idea of exploring and pioneering things rather than actually caretaking, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive virtues, but they're not perhaps both equally well treated within science. So the work I do is material science, and I'm again just sort of reflecting back on the applied sciences. I know there's some sort of textile science that happens in this space, and one of the things I did last year was give a lecture, a public lecture with the McDiarmid Institute, which went around the country. And one of the things we tried to do is explain to the public what material science is about. And so I refer to this picture of fabric as one of the ways of saying, well, actually the first context I would have used the word material in was, well, taking material to school for clothing classes. That would have been the first use of the word that meant anything to me. And actually it's a use that corresponds to more or less what we do in material science, because we worry about the things that we can make things from. And it turns out when you go down and down and down to the basics of that, that means worrying about the atoms and the structures that you can build out of atoms that we can make things from. And so here's my periodic table full of different kinds of atoms. So it's one of my favorite versions of the periodic table because you can see the kinds of materials that can be made out of those different atoms, the kind of things that they correspond to. And so what my work involves is this idea of taking atoms, creating maybe nanostructures, things out of those atoms, and then building materials out of that. So very conceptually, it's a kind of Lego, where you might be building nanostructures that are still too small to see, but that determine somehow the final function of your material. And then depending on how you arrange those things, depending on the way they interact with each other, in a very conceptual way, you're determining whether you build something out of that Lego that can fly, or that can be a sailboat, right? So this is a very schematic way of thinking about the problem. But the really important thing that I wanted to think about here is in response to Stephen Hawking's comment that we just have to get off the planet because we're going to run out of resources. Actually, there are many different ways of framing what we can do with our science. And having the courage to think about actually how we can live on this planet sustainably, for example, having the courage to think about the problem of caretaking and taking that as a serious scientific challenge, that's maybe less straightforwardly possible within science because of the relative status that we ascribe to different forms of science, the relative value that's ascribed to being the pioneer or the explorer versus a caretaker, say. So I think these are things that we need to think about. I'm just going to pop this up to acknowledge the TEU who invited me down here, and just because I think it also applies to some of how I think now about the science that I do, and that we need to think broadly, we need to be inclusive, and I think that's important. So I'm going to finish on this slide, and just with a quote from Max Planck, which is a little bit pessimistic, I suppose, and the idea that you've got to wait for the older generation to die off before we can fix anything, and it's really not true in the context of equity, because I think what's clear is that if there's a quote that I would actually replace this with now, I think it would be something about the price of freedom being eternal vigilance. And I think it's not just freedom, it's all kinds of progress. The work is never done, you need to keep doing the work. And unfortunately, when that work goes unacknowledged, which is what is often the case with equity work, there's a sense in which we feel like we've gotten somewhere when we haven't, because that work is still going on at a continuous level. And so those are just some of the things I think we need to be conscious of. So thank you all for your attention, and I'll stop there. I'm just going to put up a quick advertisement for the next 2 public lectures I know that are going to come up quite soon. I'll just leave those up there in case there are some questions.
Thank you, Nicola. I'm Cheryl Wilson. I am the former director of the Consumer and Applied Sciences program and one of the original home science alumni. And in fact, I was a student in the last years of Patricia's time here as Dean. So it's very nice to see her photographs there and to hear you speak of equity, which meant so much to Patricia. Before I thank Nicola, are there any questions? Does anyone have any questions or comments that you would like to make? We have a stream going out for people who are joining us from alumni, particularly from around the country. So if you do have questions, we will need to bring the microphone to you so that they also can hear the questions. It had to be someone right up at the back.
Thank you. I remember in a final cohort I was in, finishing off a PhD in organizational psychology. And we had a female professor. This was at Virginia Tech State University. And she was warning us about the impact of our decision to do our PhDs in organizational psychology, because the career field was becoming increasingly dominated by females, and that we should therefore expect that recommended salaries in the Hay Group and the consulting firms that specialize in compensation analysis would be diminishing over time. When I saw your example about student evaluations favoring males, it reminded me of evidence I'd come across that when men do really cool caretaking things like help put together a retirement or farewell luncheon or some social event of some kind for their workplace, they earn brownie points because they're doing nice social caretaking things, whereas when female staff members, including teachers and professors, do that, it's just sort of, it's in their root somehow. It's just they're expected to be more communal. So you certainly see some evidence that status and agentic occupations end up with higher pay scales compared to communitarian or communal, regardless of whether it's males or females in the jobs. So this affects primary school and kindergarten teachers and on and on. I was just curious if you see a connection, because the student evaluations, part of the way you get good student evaluations, I think, would be caretaking stuff. You get the marks back on time, it's pastoral care, availability to the students, and those are sort of caretaking things, and maybe the female lecturers don't earn any brownie points for doing that stuff, but the males do. Just, I don't know, just a thought. Is that possible?
Yes, I think that's a reasonably good summary of what's largely going on. Yeah. If I can't say it any better, I don't think I should try.
While I'm up the back, anyone else?
So we in Europe, we have, now the companies are forced to have like 3% female staff at the top. But at the same time, I don't want to be at the top just because I'm female.
Yep. This is why it matters how we talk about these things. I guess that's one of the things that I want to stress. My opinion on the issue of quotas is something that's changed a little bit over time. But they're really, they're very uncomfortable things. And I guess what I would use to explain my feeling now is that Max Planck quote, the idea that you've got to wait for a whole generation to die off before things will change. And that in combination with some of the sort of backlash we've seen already around the progress that has been made by women, those things in combination make me think, well, actually, the only way to get there is to actually change the status quo. And that means, well, it's worse than getting us to 50% representation right now, because you've got this historical backlog in terms of representation, which is why I show that declining plot of the percentage of Nobel Prize winners who are women. So there's no super simple way to do this. The best we could probably do in terms of quotas would be to mandate 50% now. There would be a huge cost to that. The biggest issue is the cost to the women who would be seen to be in those roles because they were women and not because they deserved it. I happen to not think that that's a valid point of view, but the reality is that there would be a big cost. My feeling is that in some sense we should just suck it up and get on with it for the sake of being fair to the next generation, for the sake of being fair to young girls who are, say, 5 years old right now. We can't actually afford to wait. So, yeah, I would say I'm probably in favour of quotas based on that kind of justification. But I agree that the people it's unfairest to are actually the women who would, feel undermined by those kinds of provisions.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I'll give one quite positive piece in that I started nursing 30 years ago. Scary thought, but there we go. And at that time, you quite often heard, particularly older patients saying, oh, I had that nice lady doctor. You don't hear that now. Equally, the male nurse, that's dropped out of common usage. They're just nurses, which I think is quite a good step forward.
Do you think that's been something that's been achieved deliberately?
No, I think they've just become more common.
Okay.
50% of the medical school is female. On the student side anyway, not on the teaching side. My question though is, on the slide that you showed of the distribution by percentage across the sciences, quite a number of them seem to have a bit of a dip in the female graduates in the 2000s, early 2000s.
Right.
Any explanation around that?
There are different, depends a little bit on which disciplines you're looking at. There are some which are particularly interesting. So computer science is one where there definitely has been a decline. It's one of the sharpest. And the interesting thing about that is that there's a suspicion that it correlates with the introduction of PCs into the family home, and that these are a thing that, due to societal stereotypes or differences, were provided preferentially to young boys, and that that's where this masculization of computer science has come from, where if anybody's gone to see the movie Hidden Figures, which is out right now, which is quite an excellent representation of this, you know, the original computers were women who did calculations at places like NASA, because it was considered a menial task, like typing. So that's something that's definitely changed in a negative sense in relatively recent years as well. Yeah. I mean, I guess I would also say there's a little bit of the other sort of the general pop psychology literature about men are from Mars, women are from Venus, those sorts of things, which maybe also influence some of those other disciplines, but that's vaguer. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I was just going to say, if you could wave a magic wand and get the University of Otago to do one thing that you think would make the biggest difference to equity at the University of Otago, what would it be? You can be provocative. Or not.
One thing. They could stick quotas on all their science departments to have 50% women in academic roles. I mean, I don't know, Barb. One thing. Without going as far as quotas, for the reasons that I guess I've already discussed, the biggest thing you can probably do is collect data about your current processes and be really transparent about what that looks like. Because of, I guess, what I talk about with people becoming quite defensive and wanting to say that no, things are actually okay when they're not necessarily. Some of the ways, I mean, data is collected, people do care about this issue, but often it's aggregated in ways either across levels of seniority in one discipline or across disciplines within the sciences, which mask some of the bigger problems. So, yeah, being transparent about the data and taking it seriously, that you need to look at it and keep monitoring it, and understand if you're making progress or if you're not. And then if you're not, you need to do more.
The backlash can be in very subtle ways. In the 80s, it was believed that the fundamental religions were pushing their brightest girls into medicine to try and influence anti-abortion, and their not quite so bright girls were pushed into teaching, particularly male, less bright boys, into teaching to stop issues like treaty awareness and things like that. Also, when women's professions have been opened up to men, seems that magically the men get to the top much more quickly than women who've entered at the same time.
Sometimes referred to as the glass escalator.
Yes, yes. And it's subtle at so many levels.
Yeah. Yeah. Subtle, I guess, the one thing I would say about things that are subtle is that they can be additionally damaging if you're then put through the extra emotional work of trying to figure out if they're actually real or not. And so subtle things can actually be very damaging. I would add that.
So thanks for that talk. That was really inspirational and nice to have those things so transparently out there. It's great. So when I was studying for my PhD, I studied under really prominent senior female mentor. And she gave us the impression that in order to be successful in science, we needed to choose whether we were going to be scientists or mothers.
Right.
And that was what she had chosen. And she felt that if we chose to be mothers, it was like professional suicide. I didn't want to fit that mold, and I've had 2 children and maintained my career, but it does come with a cost of time and energy, and until we can figure out a way for the men to have the babies, it's something that we do have to deal with. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about how we can incorporate that into equity.
I do. I guess I've got 2 levels of response. One is that I don't talk so much about the problem of women having children and families because, firstly, it should be more equitable than it is, and I know it's not in terms of who does the caring work. But secondly, I think often I've seen it used as an excuse for not dealing with some of the more unconscious bias type issues, right? Because women will have kids and therefore we can't do anything about it. There was the recent Chancellor of Massey who made his comments about women in vet science being worth 2/5 a real vet because they had families after they graduated and therefore never contributed as much to the economy, et cetera, and using that as a justification for trying to get more men into vet school. So there's that sort of dismissal of the problem, which is why sometimes I don't like to say that women having families is the only issue, because it's definitely not. On the other hand, it's really clearly a practical issue. But I think part of the issue is the messaging that you got and that other people get, that the 2 are not compatible. And of course it's hard. Of course it's hard. It's hard for a woman in any kind of working environment to have children and still do everything that needs doing. It should be, and it is actually, it's hard for men who do their fair share of family care. So it's very hard, but I think so much, it's made into a bigger problem than it should be by the way that we talk about it sometimes. And I think actually we need to just take a step back and say, you can do these things, and sometimes we're actually just going to have to adjust the way that we operate as a system in order to make it possible, because we need people to be having children, and that shouldn't exclude anyone from the workforce. One of the biggest things actually on this that I do think is an issue is the way we value experience in academia and science. So we kind of have all these systems from promotions criteria to the PBRF to whatever else that look at the cumulative impact or contribution that a person has made over their career. And that's what we evaluate people on and what we pay them on. And we don't account for career breaks well. The relative to opportunity thing is a joke, really. So we do need to get much better at unpacking that and saying, well, actually, no, you pay somebody for the contribution they're making right now. And of course, that's a function of experience, but it's not as much a function of experience as what we make out to be in academia, I think.
Thank you.
One more, or have we reached an end?
There's one up there.
Yes, one more.
I really enjoy the way that you introduce social media and pop culture into your presentations. And I noticed that you talk a lot about the various different kinds of pushback that have happened to in response to studies. And I was wondering if you could speak more on whether or not you think that the pushback in modern media and in social media, how that impacts the progress. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can. I think it's a really important part of the story, which is why I talk about it, I suppose. But for me, I would say that my experience of social media and in this story is more positive than not in terms of learning about other people's experiences, seeing how there are common threads in different places. You know, things that you would never have found out about 20 years ago now become very easily shared amongst a community of people. And I find Twitter really good for that, for seeing and interacting with women in science in different parts of the world with very, very different experiences. And probably half the content of this presentation, literally, is just from interacting with people on Twitter and seeing, you know, finding the kinds of people who are interested in this material. So I think social media is great for that. I think there are some really important things that can be learned. I think the other part of that is that so much of the problem is societal, that you've actually got to look at society as a whole in order to understand it, and the way people respond to these different kinds of messages about what science is and what it isn't. That's actually the biggest part of the problem. So I don't think we can always just be looking at what's going on within academia, within the university, but how society responds to us is a huge part of understanding what's going on. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I have a message from our PVC of Sciences. Professor Richard Barker asked me to thank you on behalf of Sciences for coming to speak to us, and I'm sure that I also would convey the thanks of those who have come today to listen to you speak. Unfortunately, Richard couldn't be here because he had a prior engagement talking to Pacifica students, welcoming them to the University of Otago. However, he did ask me to convey, and excuse me while I read his message, he said that in his view, ensuring women and more generally everyone is able to fulfil their potential is an important issue for all of us, and especially for those of us with responsibility to lead. And to continue on that note, I think you have conveyed very clearly to all of us here that we have a responsibility to actually all lead in this matter, that we need to look to ourselves, but also to look to the message that we are conveying to others if we are to sponsor. You didn't talk about sponsorship today, but you talked tonight, but you talked earlier today about mentoring of those who follow us into Sciences, but also the need to sponsor people. So it's more than just mentoring, it is that sponsorship that so often we see our male colleagues sponsoring each other, that we need to sponsor those younger than us, perhaps those of a different ethnicity to us, well, definitely those who need our sponsorship to help them on their path to careers in which they can flourish, shall we say. And certainly that is what has happened in my career. I've seen Patricia and other people who have mentored and sponsored me. So I challenge you all to go forth and sponsor. Now, it seems very fitting for me to thank you and to present you with this limited edition print. It is a print of a work that was donated to the school in memory of a student, and it is a print of Shona McFarlane sketch of the University of Otago. So we have a very female theme going on tonight. Thank you very much for your time.